The torches came first, then the screaming. It was 845 AD, and the Vikings had found the river. They didn't come to see the city, they came to take it. Long ships, low in the water, moving through the Seine like dark fingers reaching for a throat. The people of Paris didn't have an army. They had walls, prayers, and a bishop named Goslin who reportedly stood at the gate holding a crossbow, a man of God, willing to meet the devil on his own terms. That was Paris before the postcards, before the perfume, before the lovers and the lights and the language that the whole world decided sounded like romance. Paris was a siege before it was a symbol. And the thing about sieges is they don't just test walls, they test the people behind them. The city held. The Vikings took silver instead of blood, a ransom paid by a trembling king, and the longships turned back down the river. But the city remembered. Cities always do. They absorb the violence, smooth it over with stone and time, and then sell you a croissant on the spot where someone's head once rolled. That is the oldest trick in Paris's book. And it has been playing it for over 2,000 years. Because here is the thing nobody tells you when you buy the flight ticket, print the itinerary, and dream about standing beneath the iron lattice of the Eiffel Tower. The ground beneath your feet is soaked, not with romance, not with history in the clean textbook sense, but with the full, complicated, violent, magnificent weight of human civilization doing what it always does, surviving itself. This is the entire history of Paris. And it doesn't start with beauty. It starts with mud. Paris is the most visited city on Earth. Every year, nearly 100 million people pass through it. They photograph the tower. They walk the Seine. They eat cheese at prices that make no sense and feel, somehow, that it was worth it. They leave with the idea that Paris is the capital of elegance, of romance, of everything refined and civilized about the human race. But here is the fact that doesn't fit. Beneath the city, directly beneath the café tables, the metro lines, the boutique hotels, and the Michelin-starred restaurants, there are 6 million human skeletons. 6 million. Stacked in tunnels, arranged in patterns, walls built from femurs and skulls, stretching for nearly 300 kilometers underground. The bones of people who lived and suffered and died in this city moved underground because the cemeteries overflowed, because the living needed the space, because Paris had a habit of producing more death than it could politely manage. And nobody at the tourism office leads with that. The question that should haunt you and will, by the time this story is done, is this. How does a city built on that much blood, that much bone, that much revolution and plague and fire and occupation, become the thing the whole world associates with love? That is not a simple question. And the answer is not what you think. If you came here for the Eiffel Tower story, stay. Because the Eiffel Tower story is not what you think it is either. If you think Paris is a city that was always elegant, always cultured, always the gold standard of civilization, what you're about to read will quietly dismantle that idea piece by piece and hand you something far more interesting in its place. The truth of Paris is better than the myth. But the truth requires going back, all the way back, to a river island, a tribe nobody remembers, and a city that almost never existed at all. Before Paris was Paris, it was Lutetia. The name is Latin. The place was a small settlement on an island in the middle of the Seine, occupied by a Celtic tribe called the Parisii. They were fishermen, traders, river people. They knew the land, the water, the seasonal rhythms of a life lived close to the earth. They were not building an empire. They were not dreaming of cathedrals. They were living, fishing, and minding their own business on a muddy island in what is now the center of one of the greatest cities in the world. Then Julius Caesar arrived. Or rather, his generals did. Rome didn't ask. Rome rarely asked. In 52 BC, the Roman legions swept through Gaul, modern-day France, in one of the most efficient military conquests in ancient history. The Parisii fought, briefly. Then the Romans built. They always built. They constructed a proper Roman city on the left bank of the river, with a forum, an amphitheater, bathhouses, straight roads. The bones of that Roman city are still there, buried under the Latin Quarter. You can walk above the ruins of a 2,000-year-old arena without knowing it. The Aréna de Lutèce sits today in the 5th arrondissement, partially excavated, pigeons walking where gladiators once stood. Rome made Lutetia a city. But Rome also had a habit of falling. And when the empire began to collapse in the 5th century, it took the order, the infrastructure, and the relative safety of Roman governance with it. What it left behind was a city, a river, and the question of who would be next. The fall of Rome didn't happen like a building collapsing. It happened like a tide going out, slow, almost imperceptible until you looked down and noticed the sand had shifted, the water was gone, and something new was moving in to fill the space. The Franks were that something new. Germanic tribes who had been pushing at Rome's edges for generations. The Franks moved into what had been Roman Gaul and began the long, messy process of building something from the rubble. Their most important king was Clovis I, who took the throne in 481 AD and did something remarkable for a warlord. He converted to Christianity. The conversion was political as much as spiritual. By aligning with the Roman Catholic Church, Clovis legitimized his rule and tied his kingdom to the most powerful institution in the Western world. He was baptized around 498 AD, and Paris, which he made his capital, was suddenly the center of something new. Not Rome, not a clean replacement, but a rough, ambitious Christian Frankish kingdom that would eventually become France. It almost didn't work. The city in this period was barely a city at all. The Roman infrastructure crumbled without Roman engineers to maintain it. The population shrank. The roads deteriorated. The baths filled with mud. Lutetia, now being called Paris after the Parisite tribe, was more a collection of settlements around a cathedral than anything resembling the grandeur it would later claim. But it survived. Because the one thing Paris has always done, in every era, under every pressure, is survive. In 1163, somebody put the first stone of Notre Dame Cathedral in the ground. They would not live to see it finished. Neither would their children. Notre Dame took nearly 200 years to build, passing through the hands of generations of workers who would lay stone, carve gargoyle, raise arch, and die, without ever seeing the whole. It was an act of collective faith, so long it stretched across human lifetimes like a river across a landscape. And while those stones were going up, Paris was becoming something. The city was growing, chaotically, magnificently, the kind of growth that has no plan and no mercy, streets multiplying without logic, neighborhoods forming around trades and guilds, the smell of tanneries mixing with bread from the bakers and waste from everywhere. Medieval Paris was dense, loud, filthy, and alive in the way only cities under pressure are alive. The University of Paris emerged in the early 13th century, one of the first universities in the world. Suddenly, the city was drawing scholars, thinkers, theologians from across Europe. The left bank became the intellectual engine of the Western world. Students argued about God and philosophy in the same streets where butchers sold meat and children played in the mud. Then the plague arrived. The Black Death reached Paris in 1348 and did not show mercy. In 2 years, the city lost somewhere between a third and half of its population. The streets that had been loud went quiet. The markets emptied. The graveyards overflowed. People died so fast that the rituals of burial, the prayers, the processions, the dignified interment simply could not keep pace with the bodies. Notre Dame kept standing. The city kept building. Because that is what cities do when there is nothing left to do but continue. By the 17th century, Paris had over 400,000 people and a king who didn't want to be near any of them. Louis XIV, the Sun King, looked at Paris and saw a problem. The city was unruly. Its streets were unpredictable. Its people had a long, documented habit of rioting when they felt like it. And the nobility, crowded into the city, were harder to control when they had their own networks, their own power bases, their own proximity to each other and to discontent. So in 1682, Louis XIV moved the royal court to Versailles, 12 miles outside Paris, a palace so enormous, so deliberately excessive that it was less a home and more a statement that said, I am the state, I am the sun, everything orbits me and I have chosen to orbit somewhere else. Paris was left to itself. And Paris, left to itself, began to rot not in the way of ruins, but in the way of inequality allowed to fester. The city kept growing. The population kept swelling. But the wealth drained toward Versailles, toward the court, toward the perfumed halls where noblemen competed for the honor of handing the king his morning shirt. Meanwhile, in Paris, bread prices rose. Wages didn't. The poor multiplied in the city's cramped, dark streets. They could see, on a clear day, the gilded rooftop of excess 12 miles away. They could smell the inequality even when they couldn't name it. And something that had no name yet, something that would later be called revolution, was beginning to take a shape in the back streets and the bread queues and the low, angry murmur of people who had run out of patience. The city was building pressure. And pressure in Paris always finds a release. On July 14, 1789, a crowd stormed the Bastille. The Bastille was a fortress prison on the eastern edge of Paris, a symbol of royal authority and arbitrary power. There were only 7 prisoners inside when the crowd broke through. The point was never the prisoners. The point was the symbol. What came next moved so fast it seemed to have its own gravity. The monarchy collapsed. The king, Louis XVI, great-great-great-grandson of the Sun King who had abandoned Paris, was arrested. A new republic declared, a new calendar invented, a new order announced. And then the terror began. The guillotine was set up in what is now the Place de la Concorde, one of the most photographed, most elegant public squares in Paris. It is a beautiful place today, wide open, surrounded by fountains with the obelisk of Luxor rising from its center. Tourists photograph it. Couples walk through it. Between 1793 and 1794, over 2,700 people were executed there. The blade fell on Marie Antoinette. It fell on Robespierre, the architect of the terror, who eventually became its victim. It fell on aristocrats and priests and ordinary people caught in the wrong accusation at the wrong moment. The revolution that had promised liberty had developed a habit of killing anyone who disagreed with the current definition of it. Paris watched, Paris cheered, Paris wept, sometimes on the same day. And then, as suddenly as it had ignited, the terror burned itself out. But something had changed, permanently. The idea that power could be taken, that kings could be tried and executed, that the people of a city could remake the entire structure of their society through will and violence, that idea was now loose in the world. Paris had given it wings, and nothing would be the same. Out of the chaos, a small man from Corsica looked at France and saw opportunity. Napoleon Bonaparte was not Parisian. He was not even particularly French in his origins, but he understood France and Paris in particular better than almost anyone who had been born to it. He understood that the revolution had created a vacuum, that people exhausted by chaos want order, that the French, having torn down the monarchy, still wanted grandeur. They just wanted it wrapped in something that looked like the future rather than the past. Napoleon gave them an empire. He restructured the government, the legal system, the military. He launched campaigns across Europe that stretched French power from Spain to the edges of Russia. And he turned his attention to Paris with the eye of a man who understood that cities are arguments, that the way a capital looks tells you what its rulers believe about themselves. He built, he widened streets, he commissioned monuments. The Arc de Triomphe, that magnificent arch at the top of the Champs-Élysées, was his idea, begun in 1806 to honor the French army. He didn't live to see it finished either. Napoleon was defeated, exiled, died on a remote island in the South Atlantic. The Arc de Triomphe was completed in 1836, 15 years after his death. Paris received the monument anyway, because Paris has always been good at absorbing the legacies of people who tried to own it. By the mid-19th century, Paris was a medieval city wearing modern ambitions like an ill-fitting coat. The streets were narrow, dark, and labyrinthine. Disease moved through them easily. So did rioters, who had repeatedly used the tight alleyways to build barricades and stage urban rebellions. Emperor Napoleon III, nephew of the first Napoleon, had seen enough revolutions to know that geography was politics. Wide streets were harder to barricade. Open boulevards gave armies clear lines of movement. He hired Baron Georges Eugen Haussmann and gave him a mandate: remake Paris. What followed was one of the largest urban demolition projects in history. Haussmann tore down entire neighborhoods, medieval streets, ancient buildings, communities that had existed for centuries, and replaced them with the wide, tree-lined boulevards you see today. The Champs-Élysées, the grand avenues radiating from the Arc de Triomphe like spokes from a wheel. The uniform cream-colored Haussmann buildings with their iron balconies and mansard rooftops that define the Parisian skyline. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. Entire working-class communities were pushed to the outskirts. The Paris that emerged was more beautiful, more hygienic, more easily controlled, and less honest about who had always lived there. The city the world fell in love with was largely a renovation, a deliberate, politically motivated redesign. And it worked. The world looked at Haussmann's Paris and thought, this is what civilization looks like. It didn't look closely enough at what had been knocked down to build it. Paris has been conquered once in modern history. Once is enough. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. The city had been declared an open city, meaning its leaders chose not to defend it militarily, to spare it from the destruction that resistance would bring. The decision was practical. It was also a kind of defeat that went beyond military loss. For 4 years, Paris was occupied. The Nazis installed themselves in the grand hotels. They held parades on the boulevards Haussmann had built. They requisitioned apartments, commandeered art, and began the systematic deportation of Paris's Jewish population, 77,000 people, sent east to the camps. The Vel d'Hiv roundup of July 1942 saw French police, not German soldiers, French police, arrest over 13,000 Jewish men, women, and children in a single operation. They were held in a cycling stadium in brutal conditions before being transported to Auschwitz. Most did not come back. The city that had given the world the Declaration of the Rights of Man watched this happen in its own streets, and not everyone resisted. Some collaborated, some looked away, some quietly helped. The French resistance was real and courageous, but it operated in a city where the line between survival and complicity was never clean. Then in August 1944, the liberation came. Allied forces advanced toward Paris, and Hitler, facing the inevitable, issued an order: burn it. Burn Paris. Destroy the bridges, the monuments, the boulevards. Leave nothing for the Allies but rubble. The German military governor of Paris was a general named Dietrich von Koltitz. He received the order. He had a reputation as a man who followed orders. He had done so to devastating effect throughout the war. He looked at Paris, and he didn't do it. He surrendered the city intact. Why? He gave different accounts at different times. Military futility, a recognition that the war was lost. Some accounts suggest he genuinely could not bring himself to destroy what he later called one of the masterworks of Western civilization. Whatever the reason, Paris stood. On August 25, 1944, General Charles de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées through a city that was weeping and cheering simultaneously. Crowds so dense and so overcome with emotion that the sound was less like noise and more like pressure, the release of 4 years of silence. Paris had survived the occupation. It had also survived itself. Most people walk the streets of Paris and see romance. They see the light on the Seine at dusk, the bread in the boulangerie windows, the couple at the corner table of the café, the coffee going cold between them while they talk about nothing important and make it look like art. Now you know what's underneath those streets: the bones, the barricades, the deportation orders signed in the same city that invented the rights of man. This is not a story you scroll past. Because the moment you stop paying attention to what cities are built on, you lose the ability to understand what they might become. Here is the thing about the Eiffel Tower. Gustave Eiffel built it for the 1889 World's Fair, a temporary structure, meant to stand for 20 years and then be dismantled. It was controversial from the moment the plans were published. Artists, writers, and intellectuals signed an open petition against it, calling it an eyesore, a blot on the Parisian skyline, a grotesque iron skeleton that had no place in a city of stone and grace. Guy de Maupassant, the famous French writer, reportedly ate lunch at the restaurant inside the tower regularly, because it was the only place in Paris from which he couldn't see it. The plan was always demolition. But in 1909, when the 20-year lease expired and the city of Paris had the legal right to tear it down, something intervened. The tower's antenna, added years earlier, had become essential for military radio communications. It had helped intercept German messages during World War I. It was useful. And so it stayed. Not because Paris decided it was beautiful, not because the critics changed their minds, not because of romance or vision or any of the stories we tell about great art surviving against the odds. It stayed because it was a useful antenna. The most photographed structure on Earth, the symbol of romance, the backdrop of 1,000 films, the image millions of people carry in their minds when they think of love and beauty and the idea of Paris, exists today because of military telecommunications. Let that sit for a moment. And then consider this. The catacombs, those 300 kilometers of tunnels holding 6 million skeletons beneath the city, they were created starting in 1786 because the cemeteries of Paris were literally overflowing. Bodies were contaminating the water supply. People were getting sick from living next to overcrowded burial grounds. The solution was to move the bones underground, into the abandoned limestone quarries that had provided the stone to build the city above. Paris is built, quite literally, from the same stone that holds its dead. The city is its own foundation. There is a memorial in the 4th arrondissement of Paris. It is called the Mémorial de la Shoah. It sits quietly, without the grandeur of the tower or the drama of the Arc de Triomphe. Inside, there is a wall, the Wall of Names, engraved with the names of the 77,000 Jews deported from France during the occupation. Each name, each person. Most tourists don't go. The city doesn't advertise it the way it advertises the Louvre. And that absence says something. Not about Paris specifically, about all of us. About the way we curate our relationship to history, reaching for the beautiful, the triumphant, the photogenic, and leaving the difficult parts to sit in their quiet rooms, waiting for someone willing to walk through the door. Beneath the café tables, 6 million people are arranged in careful rows. On a wall in the 4th arrondissement, 77,000 names wait in the dark. In the Place de la Concorde, tourists photograph the obelisk without knowing the blade that once fell there. On the Champs-Élysées, joggers run the same route where German soldiers once marched in formation. The city holds all of it simultaneously. That is what cities do. They compress time. They layer the unbearable beneath the beautiful and keep the whole thing upright through sheer accumulated weight. Every city on Earth does this. Paris is simply better at the performance than most. The cream-colored buildings and the wide boulevards and the light, the light in Paris, which genuinely is different, warmer, more golden in the late afternoon than almost anywhere. All of it operates as a kind of grace. Not forgetting, not exactly. More like carrying. Paris carries its history the way a river carries sediment. It is in there, under the surface, making the water heavier than it looks, shaping the riverbed beneath, building up slowly over time into something that changes the landscape. You just have to know to look below the surface. And once you do, you cannot unknow it. That is the gift and the weight of understanding what you're standing on. If this history moved you, don't let it end here. Because these stories don't preserve themselves. The wall of names exists because people decided the names mattered enough to carve into stone. The catacombs are open to visitors because someone decided that 6 million lives deserve to be more than landfill. Remembering is an active choice. So is forgetting. And if you can walk away from this story without asking yourself what else you've been looking at without seeing, ask yourself why. Maybe silence has its reasons, but reasons are not the same as justifications. Here is where we end. Not with a king, not with a revolution, not with a general who refused an order in the middle of a lost war. We end with a café. It doesn't matter which one. Pick any. There are thousands. The zinc bar, the paper tablecloths, the coffee in a small cup, the waiter who moves with the particular efficiency of someone who has decided that urgency is a failure of character. Someone is sitting there right now. They do not know that they are sitting above the bones of 6 million people. They have not thought about the guillotine today, or the Frankish kings, or the Roman soldiers who built a forum 2,000 years ago on the island visible from where they're sitting. They are thinking about the coffee, about the person they're meeting, about whether it will rain. And that is exactly right. That is in fact the whole point. Paris didn't become the city of light by resolving its darkness. It became the city of light by refusing to stop living in spite of it. The Vikings came, and the city paid the ransom and kept going. The plague came and took half the population, and the city kept building. The revolution came and the blade fell in the public square, and the city reformed around the wound. The Nazis came and the city bent, not all the way, not entirely. And when they left, the city stood up and walked down the Champs-Élysées and wept until it couldn't weep anymore. And then it made dinner. That is the entire history of Paris in 37 minutes. Not elegance, endurance. The light isn't on the city. The light is the city, the accumulated warmth of 2,000 years of people choosing, over and over again, to stay. But if you think Paris holds the most dramatic secret in European history, if you think 2,000 years of blood and bone and reinvention is the darkest any city has been, wait until you hear what's buried under Rome.